This is Blackstone Joe, and you're listening to Slick Talk.
If I say I'm an oil man, you will agree.
There's the stink of oil about him.
Hello and welcome to episode 149 of Slick Talk. I am your host, Blackstone Joe, and I'm glad you're here. In today's latest installment of Q&A with the Analyst, I've sourced a few questions from our YouTube feed as well as our Instagram DMs and comments left in emails as well as our oil information slips. All that to say, however you would like to reach out, any of those channels would work well, and we encourage you to send along any questions you might have, as they will not only help us write a comment that is tailored to exactly what you need to know, they also work for content like this, which I believe is informative to listeners who might have been wondering the very same thing that you were. And I want to kick things off with replying to a question on the YouTube video for our previous podcast, 148, all about averages. Now, to lay a little foundation, that episode was about how we build those averages and what constitutes a high, low, or somewhere in between type of result that we want to keep an eye on, but isn't necessarily a quote-unquote problem. Specifically, this listener wanted to know if things like fuel dilution or oil consumption were factored into those averages and what is a quote-unquote known problem. A known problem specifically in the form of excess metal. Because averages are there to give you an idea of what a typical wear profile is. And as more samples are put into your file, we can know what's typical for you and not just that engine type in general. But here's the thing. Unlike metal counts, where there can be some leeway due to there being differences in use from one owner to another and stable wear patterns that can emerge where they might not exactly be average, but they prove over time with the benefit of trends to be okay for you and what is you own. Contaminants like fuel are a whole different ballgame. Similar to coolant or excess dirt, you shouldn't have it regardless, at least in high levels. So we don't include the oil's physical properties, which is where you will find our calculations for fuel or antifreeze in the sample or excess dirt. Those contaminants aren't guided by any sort of average in the sense that we understand what is too much or what speaks to there being contamination, and putting in an average amount of, let's say, coolant, for example, wouldn't be terribly helpful because a problem is a problem is a problem. Now, of course, there can be scarier amounts of coolant present depending on your situation, but the point is it's easier to identify an actual problem when it's contamination because it's sort of non-negotiable. A level of potassium and sodium, if you get up into the hundreds and there's no additive explanation or like harmless flux when a diesel engine is young, that's something we tend to see quite a bit. When there's not an alternative explanation, the point is there's coolant. So the next step is correcting that, not necessarily seeing if it's an average amount of coolant for the engine type, because you simply don't want to let contamination linger unless, of course, it's a case where, say, it's a high mileage engine and you kind of let it string along by using short oil runs to keep it in check. Most of the time, people want to keep their engines on the road. That's why they're sampling them. So contamination is one of those things that if it's in excess, you want to correct it. Fuel dilution, much like coolant, there is an amount that we consider high, at least in terms of the flash point and how it indicates fuel. An amount that's in excess of 2% is usually more than normal use can account for. So 2% will often be the limit that you'll see on our report. Now, that does run counter to what some manufacturers believe, and of course, some dealers might not be terribly inclined to consider our limit their own. However, we know that what we tend to see from normal use does not exceed that amount. So if you have a level that's over 2%, it doesn't really matter if it's average. The point is it's high, and a high level warrants correction because it could speak to something like a stuck or leaking injector, a bad fuel pump, maybe an issue with the computer. Something is causing fuel to be in an excess of the amount that we typically see from normal use. And while I'm at it, normal use, that tends to include things like short trips, starting the engine just before sampling. Those are ways to introduce fuel that don't necessarily speak to a problem, more so the engine not having the opportunity to warm up to operating temperature and get rid of the fuel. So if you have a sample where there is excess fuel, you will not see that in reference to averages. We're mainly keeping an average file for the wear metal comparisons. The spectral results, which is where you'll find metals, those also speak to contaminants, whether they are coolant or excess dirt. But the difference is we know, independent of averages, that certain levels of potassium and sodium and silicon, they speak to contamination, and that goes regardless of the average file we're using for comparison. There just isn't a likely reason for a high sodium level, let's say, in diesel engine oil other than coolant contamination. So we don't need an average file for that. And if we see corresponding evidence of a leak, like potassium, as I mentioned earlier, and of course poor wear, well, then an average file isn't really going to help us help you on that front. But on the flip side, we could at least tell you how the engine is wearing with that contamination present, based on how your metals compare to average. But again, if you have a sample where there is definite evidence of contamination, like coolant or excess dirt, it won't be included in the average file, just to ensure that if you have sky-high metal counts, let's say, those samples won't be grouped in the average file and make it seem like those engines produce more metal than they would otherwise in the absence of contamination. So if you're looking to know what is a problematic level of fuel, that goes along with what we tend to see from normal use, and also what is often accompanied by other symptoms of trouble, such as an increasing oil level on the dipstick, or in other words, you draining more oil than you put in. Now, the question from this YouTube comment also asked about oil consumption in addition to fuel dilution and whether or not engines that are struggling with oil consumption, if they would be included in averages. And that's another area that requires a bit of a nuanced breakdown in the sense that we can't see if your engine is consuming oil. Now, we can see symptoms of, say, a cylinder area problem where oil consumption could certainly be another symptom of it, but we can only test the oil that you still have, not what's been burned up. So whether or not you have oil consumption, that's good to keep track of, good to let us know, especially if you're adding makeup oil as a result. More on makeup oil later on, by the way. But when it comes to oil consumption, we can only know that's a thing for you and your motor if you let us know. And in some cases, an engine can wear heavily in the cylinders. Doesn't necessarily mean that oil consumption is another problem that you're dealing with. Some engines can simply wear poorly, and that's not going to go along with it. So as with additive usage, or if you're doing anything other than simply filling up the sump at the oil change and then draining it when you're done with that very same interval, let us know, because increasing oil consumption, let's say we see high cylinder area wear to go along with it, that can simply make a more convincing case for what you need to do with your maintenance plan, whether that be testing compressions to see if a particular cylinder is the problem or if there's more than one that is causing oil consumption. Whatever the case may be, it's valuable information to include on your slip so we know if we're seeing corresponding signs of a problem. But oil consumption itself won't necessarily stand out. So it's sort of impossible to include in the average file, but it's encouraged for you to let us know. That way we can help add it all together and point you in the right direction as to whether or not there is a problem brewing. So averages, remember, those are mainly just to tell you how your engine is wearing compared to others of its type. Contamination, not so much an average thing because we don't want to see it regardless. Unlike metals that can stray a bit from average and kind of do their own thing, contamination is something that shouldn't be there regardless. Next up, we have a question about sampling. Specifically, the customer wrote that they have an oil sample that was at the end of the oil change from the last half quart. Can I get an accurate reading from that sample? So here's some good news. Oil is great for many reasons, and one of them is that it holds everything we test for in a pretty even suspension. So you won't have more or less metal or contamination just from the point in the drain at which you sample. We mainly want to see oil that's midstream because you've avoided whatever dirt or debris might be from the drain plug area when you start sampling, and then ideally, you don't wait too long and miss the drain altogether, but it's okay if you sample towards the end. That's still oil that holds meaningful data, be it in the form of metals or physical properties. We can still gain an accurate overview of what it is that's going on in your engine. So don't sweat it if you're sampling towards the end. We just don't want you to wait too long and end up sampling from a dirty pan, in which case your results could be significantly skewed. And last but not least, we have another question related to sampling, and that is, the oil level was low and I needed to add some makeup. Is it still okay to sample? So the answer is yes. Go ahead and add whatever oil you need to keep that sump topped off. That's priority number one. Makeup oil is something that does affect testing somewhat, but something that we can also take into consideration and still evaluate how your engine is doing. Basically, fresh oil dilutes metals down, but how much you're adding, that's really the key. If it's a quart here or there, generally that's not going to mask any serious wear-related issues, but it does dilute metals down just like you might think. For example, an engine with a 4-quart sump, if you add 1 quart of fresh oil, you could assume that that would dilute metals by about 25%. However, we can, over time, see how your engine wears typically with the amount of makeup oil it needs. We can also evaluate how diluted those metals might be just simply by relating the amount of makeup to the sump capacity, like I just mentioned. And again, the priority is making sure you add oil when needed. We don't want you to keep the oil level low just to ensure you have a more accurate sample. That's not the best thing to do. The best thing to do is make sure the engine is properly lubricated, but the sample is relevant all the same, because even with that makeup oil, even with it helping to dilute metals down, we can still see if metals are in the right shape, if they have maintained the correct balance. That's something that makeup oil isn't likely to skew. It would just make the levels a bit lower than they might otherwise be, but you wouldn't have a situation where, let's say chrome, a ring metal, is suddenly dominant just based on the amount of fresh oil you put in. It just means that maybe instead of finding 2 parts per million of chrome, we might find 1. The wear profile, as far as how metals are balanced against each other, that should be consistent regardless of makeup. We'll be sure to take into account, however, if the levels could be diluted and if that dilution is significant or not. At the end of the day, you still have a valid sample, one that contains metal content, and of course we can check for signs of contamination, how the oil filter held up. Just let us know how much makeup you're adding and we'll take it into account. That brings today's Q&A to a close. If you have any questions that you would like to be answered on an episode of Slick Talk, don't hesitate to leave them in the YouTube comments, or you can email us, bstone@blackstone-labs.com, as well as sending us a DM on Instagram. Those are the easy ways to reach out. Don't hesitate to do so, and we'll see you next time. This is Blackstone Joe, signing off.
The Slick Talk podcast is powered by Blackstone Laboratories. If you're ready to start your oil analysis journey, visit blackstone-labs.com to order your free test kit.